I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham,
There is a tiara locked away in a vault in England that almost nobody was allowed to see for 18 years, not because it was lost, not because it was stolen, because someone, somewhere inside the walls of the British monarchy, made a decision. A quiet one. No press release. No explanation. And for nearly 2 decades, the public was left to wonder why. This is the story of the lover's knot tiara. A piece of jewelry that once sat on the head of Princess Diana and then, for reasons the palace never fully explained, disappeared from view entirely. Until one woman put it back on. If you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this reason. To pull back the curtain on the stories the royal family would rather you forget. Stories buried under decades of polished statements and careful silence. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear only gets more layered from here. Let's go back to the beginning. Further back than most people realize. Because this story doesn't actually start with Diana. It starts more than a century earlier, with a different woman entirely, and a different tiara that most people have never even heard of. In 1818, a tiara was made as a wedding gift for a woman named Princess Augusta of Hesse, who became the Duchess of Cambridge.
The ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major ambition.
It was designed in the neoclassical style popular at the time, and it carried a name that would echo through royal history for the next 200 years. The lover's knot. That original tiara passed down through the family. First to Augusta's daughter, who became the Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Then further down the line, generation after generation, the way heirlooms often do, until it eventually left royal hands altogether and was sold at auction by Christie's in 1981. Yes. The same year Diana got married. 2 lovers' knot stories, unfolding in completely different directions, in the exact same year. One tiara leaving royal ownership forever. Another version of it about to enter a young bride's life for the first time. Here's something else most people don't know. That 1818 original wasn't the only version of this design ever made. Auction records show at least 3 other copies exist, or once existed, across European royal history. One belongs to the Bavarian royal family today, sitting in a museum collection. Another disappeared entirely during the Russian Revolution in 1917, and has never been recovered or accounted for since. A third surfaced briefly and was sold at Christie's in 1985. Which means the design itself, that specific interlocking bow pattern meant to symbolize eternal devotion, has a habit of vanishing. Of slipping out of sight for decades at a time, only to resurface somewhere else entirely. Keep that pattern in mind. Because it's about to happen again, and this time, the whole world will be watching.
And it's a huge advantage if you have somebody who can be recognized as that, and not just in your country, but around the world. People don't change that much. I think they recognize those people whose commitment has been constant, and they know that those standards are not changing.
In 1913, Queen Mary, grandmother to the future Queen Elizabeth II, decided she wanted her own version of that design. Not the original. Her own. She had admired the lover's knot tiara for years, having seen it worn by her aunt, the Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, at family gatherings and formal occasions throughout her life. Queen Mary turned to Gerard, the official crown jewellers at the time, and commissioned them to build a new tiara modelled after that older design. But she didn't simply order something out of a catalogue. She was famous, even in her own era, for her deep involvement in how her jewelry was constructed and where the materials came from. For this commission, Queen Mary provided several of her own existing pieces to be dismantled and reproposed. Diamonds and pearls from a tiara known as the Ladies of England tiara. Pearls that had once sat atop another piece entirely, the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. Wedding gifts from earlier in her own life, broken down and rebuilt into something new. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a tiara built from scratch. It was assembled, piece by piece, out of the remains of other jewelry that had already carried meaning in Queen Mary's own life. Every stone had a history before it ever became part of the lover's knot. The finished piece, completed in November of 1913, held 19 diamond arches, each one crowned with a lover's knot bow, exactly as the name promised. Beneath those arches hung 19 pear-shaped pearls, moving gently with every step the wearer took.
We've been very lucky. My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity.
In its earliest form, the tiara was even taller than the version people recognize today, topped with a second row of upright pearls rising above the arches like a crown within a crown. Queen Mary wore it that way for years. Then, sometime around 1935, she made a decision. She had the upright pearls removed entirely, simplifying the silhouette into something sleeker, more streamlined. That is the version that survives today. The version Diana would eventually wear. The version the world would come to recognize. People who work with royal jewelry today still describe the tiara in almost reverent terms. A designer at Gerard, speaking about the piece decades later, described the suspended pearls as giving the tiara a rare sense of movement, something that makes it feel alive rather than static, unlike most fixed diamond pieces of its era. That movement is exactly what made it so photogenic, and exactly what would eventually make it so uncomfortable to wear. When Queen Mary died in 1953, at the age of 85, she left the tiara to her granddaughter in her will. The newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II inherited it, along with a significant portion of Queen Mary's extensive jewelry collection, built over decades of careful, deliberate acquisition. Queen Mary had, throughout her life, developed something of a reputation for pursuing jewels with royal provenance, sometimes paying well above market value to secure pieces connected to fallen dynasties. She had acquired jewelry that once belonged to Russian nobility fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, pieces smuggled out of the country by diplomats and refugees in the chaos of 1917. The lover's knot tiara entered that same collection.
Well, we don't, in many respects, need to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Not least of all because it is the monarch that is the key to this, and the constitution that underpins the monarchy.
For a time, it remained simply one more piece among many, worn occasionally by the young Queen Elizabeth throughout the 1950s, admired, but never the singular symbol it would eventually become. Then, in 1981, everything changed. A young woman named Diana Spencer is weeks away from marrying the future King of England. She is 19 years old. The world is watching her every move, and Queen Elizabeth makes a decision. The lover's knot tiara will go to her new daughter-in-law, not as an heirloom passed down with warmth over years of relationship, but as a formal wedding gift, sealing her into a family that already had century-old rules for how she was supposed to look, speak, and behave. Here's a question for you. If someone handed you a crown tomorrow and told you it came with an entire set of invisible rules attached, would you wear it with pride, or would you feel trapped by it? Tell me honestly in the comments. I want to know. Here's something most people don't realize. Diana didn't actually wear the lover's knot tiara on her wedding day. That honor went to a completely different piece, the Spencer tiara, an heirloom from her own family, worn as a quiet nod to where she came from before she became something else entirely. The lover's knot made its first public appearance months later, in November of 1981, at the state opening of Parliament. One of the most formal, most heavily photographed ceremonial events on the entire royal calendar. To the outside world, watching her step into that ceremony wearing Queen Mary's diamonds, it looked like a fairy tale continuing exactly as scripted. Cameras loved her. Magazines couldn't print her photos fast enough. She was young, she was luminous, and the diamonds on her head made her look every inch the princess the public wanted her to be. But what the cameras captured was never the whole story. It rarely is. Because behind the flashbulbs, Diana had a very different relationship with that tiara. One she didn't hide from the people closest to her, even if she smiled through it in public. She told those people it was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the physical weight of diamonds. She said it gave her headaches. That the 19 pearls, swinging freely with every turn of her head, sometimes struck her across the forehead during long evenings spent standing perfectly still. She wore it anyway, because that's what the role required. To a state visit in Australia in 1983, where she stood for hours beneath cameras from a dozen countries. To a glittering reception in Hong Kong in 1989, paired with a dress so striking the press nicknamed it the Elvis dress, an outfit still referenced in royal fashion retrospectives today. She wore it for formal portraits, for magazine features.
I mean, because I believe that there is a genuine benefit from this particular arrangement, the constitutional monarchy, and I think it has good long-term benefits. And that commitment to long-term is what the monarchy stands for.
For the moments the institution needed her to look every inch the fairy tale princess the world had already decided she was. But she started avoiding it. Not all at once. Slowly. The way you avoid a person who makes you feel small. And that's where this story really begins. Not with a scandal in the way you'd expect, but with a woman quietly rejecting a symbol the entire world assumed she loved. If you've ever smiled for a camera while feeling completely different on the inside, you already understand more about Diana than most royal biographers ever will. Stay with me, because what happens to this tiara after Diana stops reaching for it is where the real story unfolds. Where a piece of jewelry becomes something the palace can't quite decide what to do with. Where silence becomes the loudest statement of all. Before we go further, if you're finding this as fascinating as I do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who'd want to hear it, and it takes you 2 seconds. Now let's keep going. Diana didn't fight the institution loudly. She never needed to. Instead, she did something far more effective. She simply stopped reaching for the crown they handed her. By the mid-1980s, cameras that once captured Diana in the Lover's Knot tiara started capturing her more often in other pieces entirely. A version of herself that felt less like a royal mannequin, tied to one specific symbol, and more like a woman choosing her own reflection, one photograph at a time. Think about what that actually meant in a world where every outfit was scrutinized, every accessory treated like a coded message to the public. For Diana, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was one of the only languages she was allowed to speak freely. People close to the family would later describe her private complaints about the tiara. The weight of it. The 19 pearls, swinging with every movement, catching against her forehead during long evenings of standing perfectly still under bright ceremonial lighting for hours at a stretch, with no way to adjust it once it was set in place. A small detail. Almost forgettable if you only heard it once. But discomfort repeated enough times stops being small. It becomes a decision. Here is what makes this so quietly powerful. Diana never issued a statement about it. Never held a press conference to explain why she'd started favoring other pieces from the collection. She simply exercised the one form of control still available to her, inside a life where almost everything else had already been decided for her before she'd even turned 20 years old. What she wore. What she didn't. That was hers. Pause on that for a second, because it matters more than it sounds like it does. A princess dressed by an institution. Styled by expectation. Photographed every single day of her adult life by strangers who felt entitled to her image, her expression, her every gesture. And one of the few forms of quiet agency still within her reach was choosing which pieces from the royal collection she reached for, and which ones she quietly left behind in their cases. There's a reason this detail resonates so strongly with people who learn about it decades later. It isn't dramatic. There's no scandal attached to it, no villain, no headline-ready confrontation. It's smaller than that, and somehow that makes it hit harder. A young woman, thrust into an institution centuries older than she was, finding the only quiet way she could to say "I don't want this," without ever having to say the words out loud in front of a single camera. By 1996, Diana's marriage to Prince Charles had officially ended. As part of the divorce settlement, certain jewels, specifically the ones classified as belonging to the crown rather than gifted to her personally, were returned to royal keeping. The lover's knot tiara was among them. It went back into storage. Quiet. Uneventful. Logged, catalogued, and locked away, just another entry in an inventory that meant nothing to most people who would ever read it. Nobody watching at the time could have guessed what would happen next, or how long the silence that followed would actually last. Because in less than a year, the woman who once wore that tiara to some of the most photographed events of her life would be gone. And the piece she'd quietly stepped away from would become something the palace didn't seem to know how to handle in her absence. Before we go there, I need you to do something for me. If this story is pulling you in the way I think it is, subscribe now. Not later. Right now, while you're thinking about it. Because the next part of this story is where the real silence begins, the kind that lasted almost 2 full decades, and you do not want to lose your place halfway through. Let's continue. August 1997. The world stopped. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car accident in Paris, and the grief that followed was unlike anything the modern British monarchy had ever witnessed. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates and stood in silence for days. Flowers piled higher than the fences meant to hold them back. Strangers wept in the streets for a woman most of them had never met, but somehow still felt they knew. In the middle of that grief, a much quieter question began to form. One that wouldn't make headlines for years, but that mattered deeply to those close to the family. What happens now to everything she once wore? Diana's personal jewelry, the pieces gifted to her outright by family members or acquired for her own private collection, were distributed according to her wishes, largely passed down within her immediate family circle. Her sons would later be seen, on occasion, with certain pieces connected to her memory, small, quiet inheritances passed generation to generation. But the lover's knot tiara was never hers to keep in the first place. It belonged to the royal collection. In the strictest legal and institutional sense, it belonged to the crown itself, not to Diana, and not to her memory, no matter how closely the two had become linked in the public imagination. Which meant it simply sat exactly where it had been since the divorce settlement. In storage. Untouched. Unmentioned in any official capacity, tucked away among hundreds of other pieces most people will never see in person. For a piece of jewelry with that much history, that much visual weight in the public imagination, the silence that followed was almost unnatural. No royal wore it to state banquets. No royal wore it to weddings, to anniversaries, to any of the ceremonial occasions where tiaras typically make their appearances. Year after year, it simply existed behind glass and locked doors, catalogued among hundreds of other pieces, while the public slowly, gradually, began to forget it was even real. Ask yourself this. When something painful disappears from view, is that healing? Or is it simply avoidance, dressed up to look like respect? Because that's exactly what happened here. The tiara wasn't destroyed. It wasn't sold at auction the way some royal jewelry eventually is, the way its own predecessor had been back in 1981. It was simply set aside, indefinitely, the way people sometimes set aside objects connected to grief they aren't ready to face head-on. For nearly 2 decades, that is exactly what it became. Not a scandal in the traditional sense. Not a mystery with headlines attached to it every year. Just an absence. A long, total, almost deliberate feeling absence that eventually started to raise its own questions among royal watchers and historians who noticed patterns like this. Why hasn't anyone worn it? Who inside the palace actually makes that decision? And what does it mean, symbolically, that the one tiara most closely associated with Diana in the public imagination was also the one piece the family seemed most reluctant to bring back into the light? If you're the kind of person who notices what isn't said as much as what is, you already understand why this particular story has stayed with royal historians for so long. It isn't about a single dramatic event. It's about the weight of silence, stretched out over years, and what that silence eventually reveals about the people keeping it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that live in the space between what the royal family shows the world and what it quietly keeps hidden behind palace walls, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you never miss the next one when it goes up. Now let's talk about what filled that silence while the tiara sat waiting in the dark. Grief doesn't move in straight lines, and neither did the years that followed Diana's death. Prince William and Prince Harry grew up almost entirely in the public eye, their mother's memory shaping nearly every headline written about either of them, well into adulthood. Every anniversary of her death brought a fresh wave of tributes. Every documentary, every retrospective, every carefully worded interview reopened wounds that had never fully closed, for the brothers or for the public watching them grow up without her. And through all of it, one tiara sat completely untouched. Almost like the family had drawn an invisible boundary around it, one nobody dared to cross. Royal historians speculated about why. Fashion writers speculated. Long-time observers of the monarchy, the kind who track which jewels appear at which events with the precision of forensic accountants, speculated openly in print. But the palace itself said nothing. Not a single official word, one way or the other, for 18 years. That kind of prolonged silence from an institution built almost entirely on tradition, ceremony, and carefully worded statements is genuinely rare. The monarchy tends to explain almost everything eventually, in its own measured, controlled language, on its own timeline. Yet here was a piece of jewelry with real historical and emotional weight attached to it, and for the better part of 2 decades, it simply didn't exist in public conversation at all. Some believed the silence was rooted in respect. A way of allowing Diana's memory to rest without forcing her image, or the memory of her private discomfort, onto another woman's head before the timing felt right. Others believed it was something closer to caution. A recognition, whether spoken aloud inside the palace or simply understood by everyone in it, that whoever wore that tiara next would immediately be compared to Diana. Not just compared. Measured against her. Weighed against a woman the public had already elevated to something close to myth in the years since her death. Both theories, different as they sound, share the same quiet truth underneath them. The tiara wasn't just jewelry anymore. It had become a symbol so loaded with unresolved meaning that touching it meant touching everything still unsettled about Diana's place in royal history, and about how the institution wanted that history to be remembered going forward. Then, in 2011, a young woman named Kate Middleton married Prince William, in a wedding watched by an estimated global audience in the hundreds of millions, one of the most photographed events of the entire decade. The world watched, just as it had 30 years earlier when Diana walked down a similar aisle. And once again, almost immediately, the question of tiaras and legacy quietly resurfaced among royal commentators. Kate ultimately wore a different piece for her own wedding day, a Cartier halo tiara borrowed directly from the Queen's own personal collection, a piece with none of the complicated history attached to the lover's knot. Not the lover's knot. Not yet, for 4 more years after that wedding, the tiara stayed exactly where it had been for almost 2 decades already. Locked away. Catalogued. Waiting for a moment nobody could quite predict. But something was shifting behind palace walls during those years, even if the public couldn't fully see it happening in real time. A new generation was gradually stepping into roles the old one had held for so long. The Queen was aging. The institution itself was quietly preparing for a transition that would eventually reshape almost everything about how the monarchy presented itself to the world. And eventually, someone within that structure would have to decide what to do with the pieces the past had left behind, unresolved, in storage, waiting for a decision nobody seemed eager to make. Stick with me, because what happens next is the moment this entire story has been building toward from the very beginning. The moment the silence, after 18 years, finally breaks. December 2015. A reception for the diplomatic corps, held at Buckingham Palace. One of the most formal recurring events on the royal calendar, where foreign ambassadors gather beneath portraits of monarchs long gone, and the evening itself functions as a kind of unspoken stage for exactly this type of announcement. Kate Middleton, Duchess of Cambridge by then for 4 years, married to Prince William since that global spectacle back in 2011, walks into the room wearing the lover's knot tiara. For the first time in 18 years, the piece that once travelled with Diana to Australia and Hong Kong and the state opening of Parliament reappears in public, resting now on someone entirely new. The reaction is immediate, and it spreads fast. Photographs circulate within minutes across newswires and social media. Commentators who have covered the royal family for decades, people who thought they'd seen every possible permutation of royal jewelry by that point in their careers, stop mid-sentence when they realize what they're looking at. Because this isn't simply a fashion choice, and everyone watching understands exactly what this particular tiara represents, even if nobody says it out loud on camera. Some see it as an honor. A quiet, deliberate passing of history from one generation of royal women to the next. A way of finally allowing Diana's memory back into public life, carried forward with dignity rather than locked permanently away in the dark. Others see something more complicated sitting underneath that same image. A calculated institutional decision to reshape the meaning of an uncomfortable symbol. To take a piece Diana quietly struggled with in private, the very thing she'd spent years distancing herself from, and place it instead on a woman known publicly for composure, for control, for never once complaining about anything she was asked to wear. Where Diana called it heavy. Said it gave her headaches. Felt those 19 pearls strike her forehead during long evenings on her feet. Kate wore it as though it had always belonged to her. That contrast, subtle as it might seem, says more than any official palace statement ever could. Because whether the decision to bring it back was purely sentimental or something more strategic, one thing became impossible to ignore once the photographs went public. The institution had taken the exact symbol of Diana's private, quiet discomfort and turned it into a symbol of stability and continuity for someone else entirely. Was that healing? Or was that quietly rewriting the story? There's one more detail that rarely gets mentioned. One that most retellings of this story leave out entirely. In the spring of 1997, months before her death, Diana made a decision that surprised people close to her. She decided to auction off a significant portion of her own wardrobe for charity. Dozens of gowns. Some of the most photographed dresses of her public life, going under the hammer, sold to strangers, with the proceeds going toward causes she cared about. Among those pieces was that same Elvis dress from Hong Kong. The white beaded gown and its matching bolero jacket, covered in an estimated 20,000 hand-embroidered pearls. Prince William, still a teenager at the time, had opinions about that particular dress. He reportedly told his mother it was too awful to sell. Think about that for a second. Not too precious. Not too historic. Too awful. A 17-year-old's honest, unfiltered reaction to a dress that would go on to become one of the most iconic images of his mother's entire public life. Diana didn't listen to him. She included it in the auction anyway. And when the bidding closed, the dress had received one of the highest bids of the entire sale. Strangers, collectors, people who understood exactly what they were looking at, competed to own a piece of fabric that had once carried the weight of an entire royal narrative. Here's where it gets even more layered. The auction had a printed catalogue, distributed to bidders and collectors ahead of the sale. And inside that catalogue, alongside the listing for the Elvis dress, was a photograph. Diana, in that same gown, wearing the lover's knot tiara, taken during that evening in Hong Kong back in 1989. That photograph was placed directly opposite a personal letter, written in Diana's own handwriting. Think about what that image actually captured, frozen in a catalogue most people will never see. A private woman's real handwriting. A public dress about to be sold to a stranger. And a tiara resting on her head that, within months, would vanish into a vault for the next 18 years. Nobody involved in printing the catalogue could have known what was coming. Not the auction house. Not the collectors bidding on the dress. Not even Diana herself, sitting for whatever portrait or interview produced that letter. But looking back at it now, that image feels almost like a warning nobody could read at the time. The last fully public moment connecting Diana to that tiara, captured and printed and sold, just months before both the woman and the jewelry disappeared from view in completely different ways. One through death. The other through silence. Here's more, continuing directly in the same narrative voice and thread. That auction, held at Christie's in New York in June of 1997, ended up raising several $1 million for charity, spread across the causes closest to Diana's own work. It would be one of the last major public acts of her life. 2 months later, she was gone. And that tiara, the one photographed opposite her handwriting in a catalogue nobody expected to become historic, sat untouched in a vault for the better part of 2 decades that followed. There's another piece of history worth knowing here, one that reaches even further back than Diana or Queen Mary. The jewellers responsible for building the Lover's Knot tiara in the first place, the House of Gerard, held the official title of Crown Jeweller for 160 consecutive years, a role first granted to them by Queen Victoria back in 1843. During that stretch, Gerard didn't just build the Lover's Knot. They were behind some of the most recognizable pieces in the entire royal collection. The same company that assembled Diana's tiara also created the sapphire engagement ring Prince Charles gave her when they became engaged. A ring that now sits on Kate's hand, passed down the same way the tiara eventually was, through Prince William, decades later. Gerard also built the Queen's diamond fringe tiara, a piece worn on their own wedding days by Queen Elizabeth herself, by Princess Anne, and later by Princess Beatrice. 3 generations of royal brides, all reaching for the same fringe tiara, the way Kate would eventually reach for the Lover's Knot. It's worth sitting with how small this circle actually is. The same handful of jewellers. The same handful of tiaras, recycled generation after generation, carried by women who often never met each other, but who ended up connected anyway, through diamonds assembled decades before they were born. Queen Elizabeth herself wore the Lover's Knot tiara on several occasions during the 1950s, years before Diana ever entered the picture. One of the clearest photographic records shows her wearing it at a royal ball in Brisbane, Australia, in 1954, during one of the earliest and longest overseas tours of her reign. Long before the tiara became associated with heartbreak, it was simply one more piece in a young queen's rotation, worn on the other side of the world, without any of the weight it would eventually carry. That's part of what makes this story so strange to sit with. The tiara itself never changed. The diamonds. The 19 pearls. The Lover's Knot bows Queen Mary designed back in 1913. None of that shifted even slightly across more than 100 years. What changed was everything happening around it. Who wore it? Who refused it? Who inherited the silence that followed? The tiara simply existed, unchanged, while an entire century of royal history rearranged itself around those same 19 pearls. Royal historians who've studied Kate's specific attachment to the piece have floated a few different theories over the years, beyond the obvious emotional connection to Diana. Some point to simple practicality. Tiaras of this caliber aren't kept in an ordinary jewelry box. They live in secure vaults, loaned out only for the most significant occasions, and the mechanics of exactly who gets assigned which piece are almost never made public. It's possible Kate simply had the Lover's Knot properly fitted and adjusted early on, making it more comfortable and more practical for repeated wear than pieces she'd have to relearn each time. Others point to something more strategic. Wearing the same tiara repeatedly, rather than debuting something new at every major event, avoids the kind of headline that can overshadow more senior royals at the exact same function. A new tiara draws attention to itself. A familiar one lets the evening, and the guest of honor, stay the actual story. And then there's the symbolic theory, the one that keeps this story circling back to where it started. The tiara was modeled after a piece connected to the very first Duchess of Cambridge, centuries before Kate ever held that title herself. When Kate became Duchess of Cambridge in 2011, the connection wasn't lost on royal historians who'd been tracking the piece for years. Maybe it's practicality. Maybe it's strategy. Maybe it's symbolism. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that lingers longest, it's simply that some objects carry so much history inside them that the person wearing them stops being the only story being told. Let's look at how differently these two women actually used the same piece, because the numbers alone tell a story most people never stop to add up. Across roughly 16 years as a working royal, from 1981 until her divorce in 1996, Diana wore the Lover's Knot tiara only a handful of times. State appearances. A handful of formal portraits. that dinner in Washington in 1985. That single unforgettable night in Hong Kong in 1989. Photographic records of her wearing it are, by comparison to everything else in her wardrobe, genuinely rare. Kate's relationship with the same piece looks nothing like that. Since her first appearance in it back in December of 2015, she has returned to the Lovers' Knot for at least 6 separate state banquets alone, not counting the annual diplomatic reception she wore it to 4 years running immediately after its debut. In 2018, she wore it for a state banquet honoring King Willem-Alexander and Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, paired with a pale blue Alexander McQueen gown, her hair swept into a simple low bun. In November of 2022, just 2 months after Queen Elizabeth's death, it was the very first tiara Kate reached for in her new role, worn to a state visit honoring the President of South Africa. In June of 2023, she wore it somewhere unexpected. Not a state banquet inside Buckingham Palace, but a royal wedding overseas for Crown Prince Hussein and Princess Rajwa in Jordan. She paired it that night with a shimmering pink gown, a striking departure from the white and pale tones she usually chooses when the Lovers' Knot is involved. And in 2025 alone, she wore it twice, for 2 separate state visits in the same calendar year. Once in July, for the first French state visit to Britain in 17 years, hosting President Emmanuel Macron and his wife at Windsor Castle. And again in September, for a state banquet honoring the President of the United States. Lay those numbers side by side and the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One woman wearing a piece sparingly across 16 years, treating it, by all appearances, as an obligation rather than a favorite. Another woman reaching for that same piece again and again, across a single decade, until it became, by a wide margin, the most worn tiara in her entire personal rotation. The design itself carries its own quiet irony, buried inside the name most people never stop to think about. A lover's knot, in traditional jewelry design, refers to a specific decorative motif. 2 loops, intertwined, forming a shape meant to symbolize eternal devotion and unity. It's a design that appears across centuries of European jewelry, always carrying the same intended meaning. A bond that cannot be undone. Queen Mary chose that symbol deliberately when she commissioned the piece back in 1913. Not because of any specific relationship in her own life, but because the motif itself carried weight, history, and romantic meaning that predated her by generations. And yet, look at what that same symbol has actually witnessed since. A marriage that ended in divorce. A woman who found the piece physically painful to wear. A death that sent it into darkness for 18 years. And a second woman who eventually picked it back up, under circumstances that still divide people who studied this family closely. A symbol of unbreakable devotion, sitting at the center of one of the most quietly turbulent chapters in modern royal history. Maybe that's simply what happens to objects that outlive the people who first gave them meaning. They keep existing. They keep getting worn and set aside and rediscovered by people who never asked to inherit whatever weight came attached to them. The pearls don't know whose forehead they're striking. The diamonds don't know which marriage they've outlasted. They just keep catching the light, generation after generation, waiting for whoever reaches for them next. Here's more, drawing on well-documented facts about how royal jewelry ownership actually works, which adds real context to the whole story. It helps to understand something most people watching these stories never stop to ask about. Who actually owns any of this? The crown jewels themselves, the ones used only at coronations and the state opening of Parliament, are held in trust for the nation. They pass automatically from monarch to monarch, kept secured at the Tower of London. No individual royal, not even the king himself, actually owns them in the way an ordinary person owns their own belongings. But most of what shows up at a state banquet isn't crown jewels at all. It's something else entirely. A separate, much larger personal collection, built up over generations, existing in its own kind of legal grey area. By the time Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, her personal collection alone was estimated to include more than 300 individual pieces of jewelry. 98 brooches, 46 necklaces, 37 bracelets, 34 pairs of earrings, 20 separate tiaras, the lover's knot was just one piece, sitting inside a vault stocked with hundreds of others, most of which the public will never see even a single photograph of. Pieces made before Queen Victoria's death in 1901 carry their own specific classification. They're treated as heirlooms belonging to the crown itself, passing automatically from monarch to monarch, whether an individual wants to keep them or not. Anything made later, gifted later, acquired later, exists at the personal discretion of whoever happens to be wearing the crown at the time. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Because it means an object like the lover's knot tiara occupies a strange kind of ownership limbo. Diana didn't own it, not really, even while she was legally married into the family that did. It was loaned to her. Held for her. The way it was later held for Kate. Neither woman ever actually possessed it. They simply borrowed history for a while and then handed it back. Compare that to what happened with Princess Margaret, the Queen's own sister, just a few years after Diana's death. When Margaret passed away in 2002, her family faced a very different situation than the one surrounding the lover's knot. Margaret's jewelry, including a piece known as the Poltimore tiara, wasn't part of the Crown's official collection. It was hers, personally, outright. So in 2006, her children made the decision to sell it. The Poltimore tiara alone sold at Christie's for nearly £1 million. Not for charity. Not for sentiment. According to people close to the family, the money went almost entirely toward paying inheritance tax. Sit with that contrast for a second. One piece of royal jewelry sold at auction to cover a tax bill because it belonged to one woman outright. Another piece, the lover's knot, locked away for 18 years because it belonged to no one at all. Diana herself made her own choice about this exact question months before she died. In June of 1997, she auctioned off 79 of her own dresses, pieces she did own outright, personal property separate entirely from anything tied to the crown. That auction raised more than $3 million for cancer and AIDS research. It's worth noticing what she chose to let go of and what she never had the option to let go of in the first place. The dresses were hers. She could sell them, give them away, do whatever she wanted with them. The tiara never was. And that's really the quiet undercurrent running through this entire story. Diana spent years finding small, private ways to push back against a role she didn't fully choose. But even her rejection of the lover's knot tiara, real as it was, only ever went so far. She could set it aside. She could stop reaching for it. But she could never actually give it away, sell it, or make the decision permanent. Only the institution could do that. And for 18 years, the institution chose silence instead. You decide. I genuinely want to know what you think, because royal historians themselves are still split on this one, and the debate hasn't settled even a decade later. Kate has worn the tiara multiple times since that first appearance, always with the same steady, practiced composure that has defined her public image from the very beginning of her time in the royal family. No visible struggle. No reported discomfort. No hint of the private complaints Diana once shared with people close to her. Maybe that's simply who Kate is, temperamentally suited to a role Diana never fully wanted in the first place. Maybe the institution finally learned, after everything, how to prepare someone for the weight they hand her, in a way they never managed to do for a 19-year-old bride back in 1981. Or maybe, and this is the harder thought to sit with, some things only become easy to carry once the person who struggled with them first is no longer here for anyone to compare you to. What this story really shows us is something bigger than one tiara sitting in a vault for 18 years. It shows how the royal family handles its own history. Quietly. Carefully. Sometimes for decades at a time. Choosing exactly when the past is allowed to resurface, and exactly who gets to wear it when that moment finally comes.